Good morning. We are continuing our studies of Acts, and we are coming this morning to chapter 23, although last week we just got to chapter 22, verse 30, so we'll start one verse prior to the beginning of chapter 23. As you know, we've suggested all the way through that this concluding section of Acts is Luke's, how he organizes it is around three trials. Each section has been organized around three something. And this last section, three trials. This is really Paul's vindication as Luke presents his case not only for Paul but for Paul's message. 3 times Paul goes to trial, 3 times Paul's vindicated, and the vindication each time gives a new opportunity for Paul to express his great testimony and his great theology. And so Luke, as he masterfully weaves this story together, is able to develop his own thesis as well, using the story of Paul and the experience of Paul to accomplish that. And so we're coming this morning to the first of these trials. We've seen the events that lead up to it. Paul has come back to Jerusalem. We're in 58 A.D. now in the spring. There's a riot that erupts concerning the presence of Paul in the temple. That leads to an opportunity for Paul to address this riotous crowd there in Jerusalem. And he does so, and Luke gives us pretty much the record of that sermon that Paul preaches. The crowd listens fairly politely to Paul until he says the magic word, Gentiles. And then they go ballistic. That was really the critical problem in all of Paul's message and ministry, was this connection to the Gentiles and the status of the Gentiles that kept playing into the conversation. And so it was that triggered then a new eruption of violence against Paul. And Paul is, as a result of that, then taken to this little castle kind of facility there called the Antonia. Luke calls it the barracks. And there's where he's kept overnight. The tribune, as he's called, the chiliarch is the term, the Greek word there, the ruler of 1,000 Roman soldiers is the one with whom Paul is interacting. And he still is caught on the horns of a bit of a dilemma because he's got Paul here, who obviously has done some bad thing. Otherwise, why are these people so upset with him? And yet, for the life of him, he can't figure out what he did. And when he asks the crowd doesn't give him a straight answer. And so, and then to make matters worse, he finds out Paul is a Roman citizen, so he has to give him special treatment on that accord. And all of this is creating a bit of a problem for our poor friend Lysias. That's his name, as we'll find out today. So, Lysias, in order to try to resolve and clarify what's going on, actually summons a meeting of the council. The council there, the Sanhedrin of the Jewish people in Jerusalem, to try to get some kind of idea of how he should dispose of Paul. And it's that moment that we pick up with then this morning. So we're at verse 30 of chapter 22, and then we'll cover all of chapter 23 today. A pretty big bite, but it'll go fairly quickly, so I don't think we'll have any problem making it through this material. This is on page 144. If you're using the Pew Bible, and it's otherwise Acts chapter 22, verse 30. Speaking of Lysias now, since he wanted to find out what Paul was being accused of by the Jews, the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and the entire council to meet. He brought Paul down and had him stand before them. While Paul was looking intently at the council, he said, "Brothers, up to this day I've lived my life with a clear conscience before God." Then the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. At this, Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law you order me to be struck?" Those standing nearby said, "Do you dare to insult God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not realize, brothers, that he was the high priest." For it's written, you shall not speak evil of a leader of your people. When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and the others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees' group stood up and contended, we find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? When the dissension became violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down and take him by force and bring him back to the barracks. That night the Lord stood near him and said, keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, you must bear witness also in Rome. In the morning, the Jews joined in a conspiracy and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who joined in the conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we've strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the council must notify the tribune to bring him down to you on the pretext that you want to make a more thorough examination of his case. And we are ready to do away with him when he arrives. Now the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush. So he went and gained entrance to the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to report to him. So he took him, brought him to the tribune, and said, the prisoner Paul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you. The tribune took him by the hand, drew him aside privately, and asked, what is it that you have to report to me? He answered, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow as though they were going to inquire more thoroughly into his case. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him. They have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they kill him. They are ready now and are waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, ordering him, tell no one that you've informed me of this. Then he summoned 2 of the centurions and said, get ready to leave by 9 o'clock tonight for Caesarea with 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. And provide mounts for Paul to ride and take him safely to Felix, the governor. He wrote a letter to this effect. Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency, the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them, but when I learned that he was a Roman citizen, I came with the guard and rescued him. Since I wanted to know the charge for which they had accused him, I had him brought before their council. I found they accused him concerning questions of their law, but he was charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him during the night to Antipatris. The next day they let the horsemen go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he belonged to. And when he learned he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. Then he ordered that he be kept under guard in Herod's headquarters. So lots of action in this chapter, and we'll try to work through that fairly efficiently this morning. But let's have a word of prayer first of all. Father, we're grateful that you give us this privilege of gathering together in your name. We thank you for your people. We thank you for the love you give us for your word, for the instruction that we receive from it. We pray that the same Spirit that guided the pen of the great author Luke would guide our hearts as well into an understanding and appreciation of those things that you set before us here. We give you thanks for it now in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, back at verse 30. Since he wanted to find out, Lysias wanted to find out what Paul was being accused of by the Jews, the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and entire council to meet and brought Paul down and had him stand before them. Lysias, as we indicated earlier, had a problem. He obviously had a hot potato on his hand here. Paul was clearly, for some reason, causing this precipitous reaction among the Jewish people. Lysias could not fathom what it was exactly, and so he decides that he will invoke what was his privilege to do, that is, to summon a gathering of the council. This council is called the Sanhedrin. It was sometimes called the Council of 70. It was actually part of the leadership arrangement that Moses himself had set up. The Sanhedrin had met continuously all through the history of Israel, clear back to the time of the Exodus, and possibly even before. At least there's an inference to that effect. This was the supreme ruling body of the Jewish people. Israel was an occupied land, as you know. Rome was, of course, occupying the entire Mediterranean world. But one of the distinctive qualities of Rome, as opposed to other of the ancient empires, was that they allowed a distinctive amount of autonomy to their occupied lands. Unlike, for example, the Assyrians, who would tend to deport people and haul them off to other places to keep a certain amount of instability as the order of the day. The Romans were just the opposite. They tried as much as possible not to just intrude into the internal affairs. You had to pay the tribute, that sort of thing. You had to pay the taxes and otherwise not step over the lines or incite revolt or riot or that sort of thing. But otherwise, the Romans were perfectly willing to allow local political authority to operate. And that was what was going on here. So, at this point, Lysias wants to invoke what is the indigenous ruling body to try to figure out what he, as the Roman authority, should do, and that's what he does. He calls this council together, and the very next morning, Paul would be brought before them. Verse 1 of chapter 23, while Paul was looking intently at the council, he said, "Brothers, up to this day I've lived my life with a clear conscience." The term that Luke uses here for looking intently really means to study. We get the impression Paul just kind of, probably while preliminary proceedings were going on, was just examining this group. These were people, many of whom he was familiar with. Paul, of course, had once acted as an agent of the Sanhedrin. There were at least some of the people on the Sanhedrin at this time who were some of those with whom Paul used to hobnob. These were people that he was familiar with. It was to this group that he had gone originally to get letters of authority that he would take to Damascus in the hope of arresting Christian people there and bringing them back to Jerusalem. So he had some inside understanding of this group. Certainly he understood the political configuration of the group. And he's probably plotting a little bit. He's thinking, you see. This is really the sense of this. So he's looking at them, he's studying them, and when the moment comes where he's given permission to speak, he makes this introductory comment, probably intending to give a more lengthy discourse, although he's somewhat rudely interrupted, as you noted. But the first statement he makes is, "Brothers, up to this day I've lived my life with a clear conscience." Probably even referring to that time before his conversion, when he was acting on behalf of this group. Even then, in a sense, he had a clear conscience. As he tells us elsewhere, he was doing these things under a misimpression. He was mistaken. He doesn't try to vindicate himself or excuse himself for his crimes against the church, but he at least wants to make it clear that he thought he was doing God's work. When he was going to Damascus, he thought he was acting on behalf of God, not realizing he was in fact acting against the interest of God. So even then, in some sense, he had a clear conscience. Certainly since his conversion, he had a clear conscience. The sense of clear conscience here is not to say that Paul was affirming sinless perfection. He means here he was legally blameless. That's the idea of the term that Luke is using. There's no crime of which I am properly charged. There's no reason for this proceeding to continue because I have a clear conscience. So it's really an affirmation of innocence or not guilty, you might say at the very beginning. Up to this day, I've served God with a clear conscience. Now, he was probably going to say more, but as we notice here, then the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. Wham! Ouch! Paul goes. Now, we might think it's a little cheeky how Paul responded to this. But there's some things you need to know about just the dynamics of this moment. First of all, Ananias was not the properly constituted high priest. We know this from Josephus. In fact, if I could just say on the side, every Christian who wants to be a little bit serious about the New Testament, you really ought to read Josephus. It's very accessible, very readable. This is not like arcane, difficult, ponderous stuff that, only strange, weird people in high ivory towers read. This is very readable and very interesting. And he gives us a whole lot of background of the political life in Israel during these years. And so just for that reason alone, it's good reading. Especially read what's called the Jewish Wars, which covers a lot of the events that we're talking about here. Josephus mentions Ananias and makes it quite clear that Ananias was not the legitimate high priest, and indeed the office of high priest was at this moment vacant. There were some rather specific guidelines and policies as to who should be the high priest, and Ananias was clearly not it. But because of some political deal-making that he had done with the Romans, he got himself installed here, even though he was not legitimately there. Now, at this point, he makes matters worse by violating Jewish rules of due process. The ancient Hebrews, this is, by the way, just one of the most striking things about the Hebrew culture, is they had a vastly higher and more elevated sense of due process than any of the ancient civilizations, including Rome. Rome had a pretty good idea of it with respect to citizens, but they were nowhere, of course, with respect to non-citizens. But the Hebrews had a very elevated notion of due process. A great deal of our own sense of due process and our system of jurisprudence has its roots ultimately back in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And Paul knew what his rights were, He knew that he was not to be tortured or have pain inflicted on him as a means of getting testimony. The Romans would do that, not the Jewish people. For Paul to be slapped at this point was therefore a violation of the rules, and the orders were given by someone whose legitimacy was itself in question. And so when Paul is slapped on the face, he makes this retort, verse 3, "At this Paul said to him, 'God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law, you order me to be struck?'" Now, it sounds like Paul is just, at this point, being a little vindictive. "You whitewashed wall, God will strike you," You can kind of imagine some popular colloquialisms that might capture what we think Paul is doing here in reaction to this. Actually, it is interesting. This was more of a prophecy than just a kind of a verbal slap back. Ananias was deposed from this position of being a high priest not long after this incident in 58 A.D. He and his brother, whose name was Hezekiah, both had to flee, and they went and hid in an aqueduct, which was there in Jerusalem, hiding from those who were trying to find them. They were, however, located, and both of them were killed hiding in that aqueduct. So Ananias only survived another 2 or 3 years after this incident, and indeed, just as Paul predicts, God did strike him, and Paul was probably giving him an opportunity to repent here as he was giving him this warning. But Paul says to him, "God will strike you, you hypocrite," is the idea there. You are sitting in a position of judgment against me, and yet you yourself are violating the very rules that were designed for my protection. That's the reaction that Paul issues then. Those standing nearby, of course, are offended because Paul would say something like that to the one who is at least ostensibly the governing individual here, the person who is in charge of this proceeding. And so they say to Paul, "Do you dare to insult God's high priest?" Now, Paul's response here is not to be taken as Paul was clueless. Oh, I didn't know he was the high priest. Oh, shame on me. No. Paul knew exactly what the deal was. He knew Ananias. He knew his questionable status. He knew the whole configuration of the room. And, of course, Luke is writing to people who would be more familiar with these things than we are at 2,000 years' distance. That's why reading Josephus can give us a little light here. Paul said, I didn't realize. He's being sarcastic. Oh, I didn't realize he was the high priest, you see. He knew the questionable status of Ananias. And so he's really saying more than meets the eye here. Paul himself, of course, doubted very deeply whether Ananias was properly discharging those duties. I didn't realize he was the high priest. I thought he was just a usurper and a hypocrite. Sorry. And so Paul says, for it's written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. As if to say, if Paul had, really acknowledged the role that he was allegedly discharging, he would have been somewhat more respectful, possibly. But in any event, you can kind of see the inner dynamics there. Paul then noticed, or Paul had noticed, really, that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees. And thus he called out in the council, brothers, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I'm on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. I think you're probably familiar with this difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Both of these religious political parties had originated back in the Maccabean period about 150 years prior to the events that were more like 200 years before the events that are now before us. The Sadducees had become, by this time, what you might call the political and religious liberals of the day. They were naturalistic. They disbelieved ideas like heaven and hell, life beyond the grave, supernatural ideas of angels and demons and that sort of thing. They were very naturalistic. In that sense, they'd be very up to date. They would fit right into contemporary culture, which has a pretty healthy dose of that kind of outlook. They were also, in this sense, liberal, that they were very open to cozy relationships with Rome. These were the dominant political power in the Sanhedrin. They had, as it were, the majority votes, and they were able to exercise considerable influence because of that. The high priestly family were all Sadducees. The Pharisees were there kind of like a thorn in their side. They had enough power to at least have, in some cases, some veto authority, but nevertheless, they were not the ones truly in charge. The Sadducees had the political clout, but they were the closest to disbelievers. They had really sold the soul of Jerusalem, particularly in terms of the religious establishment, into the back pocket of Rome. That's why, as I believe the book of Revelation is really focused on this point, Jerusalem came to be called the harlot city, or the great Babylon, because it had really sold its birthright, as it were, to Rome. And this unhealthy alliance between corrupt Rome and corrupt Jerusalem is part of the central motif, really, of the whole book of Revelation. Well, this really captures it here. Now, the Pharisees, on the other hand, were the religious and political conservatives. They accepted the whole Old Testament, not just a restricted part of it. They did believe in life after death. They believed in supernatural reality, that sort of thing. And so Paul is siding here with the Pharisees. His own training was Pharisaical. He didn't really object to the theology of the Pharisees, as Jesus didn't object to it. The Pharisees were much closer to Jesus than the Sadducees. Jesus, ironically, has much more severe censure for the Pharisees, as you know, but nevertheless, in terms of theology, he was much closer to them, as was Paul. Paul says here he was the son of a Pharisee, probably meaning both literally and figuratively. He was a descendant of the spirit of the Pharisees, in a sense. He loved the law. He wanted to be true and faithful to the teaching of the Scriptures. He didn't want to water it down, reduce it to a kind of naturalistic, ethical mishmash that lost its essential power. And so, in that sense, he's willing to invoke his allegiance, at least his traditional allegiance with the Pharisees. So, he makes that great declaration, I'm a Pharisee, I'm on trial because of the hope of the resurrection. Now, that was cagey on Paul's part. Certainly, the resurrection was part of the message that he always preached. It was central to the gospel. The idea that Christ rose from the dead, the idea that we will rise from the dead, All of that was part of his message. The thing that actually had gotten him into trouble there was more of his commitment to the Gentile ministry. But at this point, Paul is just playing his cards. He's going to do whatever is going to be in his advantage at this moment. And this is certainly not an untruthful statement, and he knows it may accrue to his benefit, so he takes that tack. When he said this, verse 7, a dissension began, just as Paul had calculated it might, between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. These gatherings of the Sanhedrin were extremely volatile. Josephus again tells us that they often erupted into violence. This was not an unusual situation. These people detested each other. They were the ruling body, and they were there in a representative capacity, not unlike our own governments of representation, a kind of republic in a sense. And so some were representing the more conservative elements of the Jewish society, many the more liberal elements, but they did not get along very well. And so these meetings could be tumultuous, and indeed sometimes erupted into true violence. And it was just a real handful. And so Paul was shooting right for the vulnerable point. I mean, this was very astute on his part. And just as he had thought it might happen, indeed it did happen. There's a kind of uproar that ensues as a result of Paul making that statement. The Sadducees, Luke gives us a little kind of parenthetical remark. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. In case we weren't aware of that, Luke gives us that inside information. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees group stood up and contended, "We find no fault with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" Now Luke carefully says it's the scribes of the Pharisees. The scribes were the best educated, the most scholarly wing of the Pharisee group. They had the most elite education. Theirs was the task of being trustees of the Word of God. And that was an extremely high calling and was one of the most prestigious. And so these are the people who, as it were, carry the greatest freight among the Pharisees, who stand up now and begin to actually argue on Paul's behalf of all things, you see. And so they say, well, hey, Paul spoke to us yesterday, and he said that while he was on his way to Damascus, he was confronted with a great supernatural vision. Now, he says that vision was of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, we don't know who it was. Maybe it was, but maybe it was just a spirit, or maybe it's an angel. Maybe the guy's a little off-kilter, but who can say a priori it didn't happen? Isn't it possible the guy actually confronted an angel? And certainly the Pharisees were prepared to allow that such things would and could take place, that supernatural forces could intrude into history, and that maybe Paul had confronted such a being. And so the Pharisees all of a sudden are fairly favorable to Paul because he's, of course, taking a rather Pharisaical point of view in terms of that particular dispute. And so they're, ironically rising up to actually argue, as it were, Paul's case. So that brings us then to verse 10. When the dissension became violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down and take him by force and bring him back into the barracks. So the tribune, you have to feel some sympathy for the poor guy. All he wants is a straight answer here. Every time Paul shows up, you get this violent reaction. He's just scratching his head, what is the deal? And he was hoping he'd get some sort of statement, like an information against Paul, some kind of indictment, something that would at least give him, something to work with here. And all he gets is just one more riotous eruption of violent antagonism toward Paul, and now he finds some of these people are actually favoring Paul and some aren't, and Lysias doesn't know what to do, and he's afraid he's going to lose his Roman citizen. I mean, he has a high fiduciary obligation here to protect Paul, and now all of a sudden it looks like Paul's going to get ripped apart by this mob, and so he goes down, rescues him, takes him back to the barracks, no better off than he was before this thing began. But from Luke's point of view, he wants us to notice no charge was successfully lodged against Paul. That in fact this becomes the first trial of Paul and, as it were, the first vindication of Paul. The three trials are each escalating in their dignity. The first one is the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. The second one is the Roman governor, who is Felix, and I'll include with that Festus, his successor. It's the same tribunal, as it were, the same trial, although it extends over a period of time. The third one is in front of the king, one of the Herods, who actually represents both Roman and Jewish authority, and is the highest tribunal before whom Paul appears when he once again gives his testimony. So those are the three trials. This is the first of them now. And of course, here we have we'll say it's at least a hung jury at this point is the outcome of this adjudication. That night, the Lord stood near him and said, "Keep up your courage, for just as you've testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome." A great word of encouragement. I've never had anything like that happen exactly. I've never had, a voice come to me or any kind of apparition appear or anything like that. But it does happen to us as Christians. I don't know if you're like this. I think most of us have a tendency to kind of beat ourselves up, I teach Sunday school, then I go home and go, man, I just really laid an egg today. That was terrible. And I don't know what it is. It just, you get that feeling that you just really didn't quite hit the mark and you feel bad or whatever. And it just seems so often that in some unexpected and unlikely way, some word of encouragement comes just out of the blue. There's so many times when just incidental comments will be made, by someone that couldn't have known anything about what I might have been feeling. You've had this experience. And I just take that as a word from God. These little providential, messages that will come by people that were unwitting. They didn't realize how much you needed to hear that little comment. And there it was, and you just think, that means a whole lot. And for Paul, of course, this was a very rich moment to have this. Because he's as human as the rest of us. Nobody likes to be, threatened in that way and have their life flash before their eyes, as Paul probably was at that moment. And to have this word of encouragement really was a great word of encouragement for all of us. Because God knows our frailty. He knows we are but dust. And He will give us that encouragement as we need it. And so I think Luke includes that just to give us all that sort of a little insight. All right, verse 12. In the morning the Jews joined in a conspiracy and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. Now we have this well-known incident where you have the 40 or more Jewish men who bind themselves in an oath. The question has sometimes arisen, what happened to these guys, You kind of wonder, don't you? Because obviously they didn't make good on their oath. Paul escaped through their net. Did they all starve to death in Jerusalem? What happened there exactly? A Jewish oath was a very high thing, and they wouldn't just lightly dismiss it. I think we get the answer to that from the Talmud. The Talmud does contemplate that oaths can be taken which involve a fast. But the Talmud also contemplates those occasions when it may become impossible of performance. Lawyers have an idea in the law about contracts that become impossible of performance. Well, oaths had the same possibility, that for whatever reasons they might become absolutely impossible. And then the Talmud simply does an ethical judgment and says, you're choosing between two evils. It is an evil thing to eat in violation of an oath, which was a fast. But it is an evil thing to commit suicide by not eating. So what to do, you see? And the Talmud says it is a lesser evil to violate an oath than it is to die by suicide. The Jews had a very high view of life. They did not contemplate any form of suicide as legitimate. And so that was the judgment that was made. However, if you were in an oath that you could not fulfill because it truly become impossible, then you were supposed to go to the high priest, present the circumstances, and actually be absolved of the oath by the high priest making a statement to that effect. There's almost a 100% chance that's what happened here. That these men, once it became obvious that they would not be able to fulfill their vow, went and were able to be discharged from it, going through that procedure. So in case you were worried about them dying there, slow death by starvation, it probably didn't happen to these guys. There were more than 40 who had joined in this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We've bound ourselves strictly by this oath to taste no food till we've killed Paul. The plot is this. So look, you must notify the tribune to bring him down to the council on the pretext that you want to make a more thorough examination, and we will ambush him on the way. Probably their plan was to catch Paul in that about 500-yard distance from the Antonia, which was near the temple, to the temple precincts itself where the council would meet. They would be able to, as it were, come out of the bushes, daggers in hand, and do in Paul, and some of them might actually, give their lives, but they viewed it as that serious to try to accomplish that. So that was the plan. It was your typical, plain vanilla ambush. And so, verse 16. Now, the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush, so he went and gained entrance to the barracks and told Paul. It's the only mention we have in the book of Acts, or really in the whole Bible, of Paul's extended family. So we know very little about his family. We know now that he has a sister, so we have that much. And we don't know where she was. Some have thought she must live in Jerusalem because her son was there. That's less likely than that this son was in Jerusalem on the same basis that Paul had been, namely for an education. It's more likely that the sister lived probably in the same vicinity as Paul's rest of his family, which was Tarsus. It was probably a very well-to-do family. The school of Gamaliel was quite expensive, and they did not have FAFSA. They didn't have all of those financial aid forms to fill out in those days. If you couldn't write a check, then your kid didn't go to the school. That was basically the idea. And so Paul must have come from a moneyed family, and apparently the money also was in the broader family, because now we have a son. This is speculation, but presumably this son is there as a young boy, probably, 7 to 11 years old. That's probably the guess of his age. And he's there probably gaining his grammar school education in Jerusalem as Paul had done. Now, again, that's somewhat speculative, but that seems to be fairly reasonable construction of what probably happened. He knows Paul. We don't know how. We don't know what the circumstances were of that, but obviously he has some interest in Paul's welfare. He learns about the ambush. We don't know how that happened, but apparently it wasn't a very well-kept secret. And so that seems to be, it must have been some kind of somewhat common knowledge. So anyway, he goes, he gains access to Paul. Paul is able to take visitors because he's a citizen. And if he authorizes someone to visit him, then they are permitted to come. That's part of the privilege he enjoys. So this young boy comes, gives Paul the scoop on this plot for an ambush. So Paul says, verse 17, Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to report to him." So Paul sends him on his way to the chiliarch, the chief commander here, Lysias. So he took the young boy to the tribune, and the word was, "The prisoner Paul called me, asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you." The tribune took him by the hand, drew him aside privately, and asked, "What is it you have to tell me?" The fact that Luke notes this little sort of incidental thing, he took him by the hand, suggests the guy was probably not 25 years old. Probably wasn't, he was probably a boy. Probably 7, 8, 9, 10. And it's a rather interesting kind of show of civility on the part of this chiliarch. Of course, he was concerned about Paul. He was a citizen. He gave him special treatment, but that is a kind of a nice little show of humanity on the part of the tribune there. "What is it that you have to report to me?" Verse 20. He answered, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down." I won't read all that. You know it. He gives a good recitation of the threat that had been mounted against Paul, and warns the chiliarch that at this point they're just waiting for your consent to send Paul down once again. But behind the scenes, the plan is to come out of the woodwork and do Paul in. So the tribune dismissed the young man, ordering him, "Tell no one that you've informed me of this." So this is great movie stuff, isn't it? Wouldn't you like to see this? So anyway, the chiliarch dismisses the young boy sort of into the evening, and says, "Okay, let's keep this between ourselves." And then, of course, the tribune here, concerned about Paul's welfare and knowing that this is a lively threat. These people can be very violent. I mean, they're constantly dealing with the zealots. One of the names for the zealots was assassins. And the name for assassin then actually meant someone that carried a little dagger. And there were people that just wandered around the streets of Jerusalem with these little daggers, and they would take out a Roman soldier if they had the opportunity, just right in the back, knife them, they were dead, and they'd be gone down an alley. And so this Roman population was constantly dealing with this kind of threat, and it was a very lively problem. He knew this wasn't just poetry, that Paul was in some degree of jeopardy because of this. Then he summoned 2 of the centurions and said, okay, get ready, leave by 9 o'clock tonight for Caesarea, and get a load of this, 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. The spearmen actually used little darts. They were not long spears, but they were sort of short spears, and they were kind of, what do you call those things? They're like bows and arrows that you pull a trigger. It was kind of like that. They were very lethal weapons that they carried. So anyway, here's 470 people that have been assigned the task of getting one guy out of town safely. You know, when God's providence is in your favor, you got nothing to worry about. And so here, virtually, this huge show of force of the Roman power is brought to Paul's disposal to make sure that he is not put at risk by this threat against him. Obviously, and it takes place the night before. We don't know if these guys were lying in wait, and then when they realized the futility of their task, they just despaired, or maybe he actually got Paul out of town before they'd had a chance to even assemble for the purpose of trying to assassinate him. But in any event, he gathers this rather respectable show of force, these horsemen and so on, and sends Paul out of town. He provided mounts for Paul. Paul was given a horse to ride, and he was told to be taken safely to Felix the governor. Felix the governor is a piece of work, Now, I'm going to save a discussion of him for the next time that we are together. And while I'm on the subject, I might mention we will not be together till 3 weeks from now. We won't meet next week or the following week because we have a Christmas break. So the first week in January, we'll get back together and we'll see Paul's trial before Felix. But Felix is a character of the first order, and I want to save any discussion of him for later. But anyway, that's the guy that's the governor. He was eventually fired and replaced by a much more sane, balanced guy named Festus. And Paul actually appears before both of them, and that's what we're considering the second trial here. But anyway, he's taken off to Felix the governor, and the letter that's written here is really pretty classic itself. So Claudius Lysias, verse 26, to His Excellency, the Governor Felix, greetings. Listen to this. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them, but when I learned he was a Roman citizen, I came in with the guard and rescued him. Whew. Yeah. Boy, you talk about a hero. Jesus talks in one of his parables about a man who reaps where he does not sow. You know that term? I think the ability of Lysias to spin the facts here is pretty impressive. You recall what actually happened, don't you? Paul was about to be beaten to a pulp by the crowd. Lysias was concerned strictly to restore order. He assumed Paul was a malefactor. He arrested him, bound him, put him on the rack, and was about to expose him to this scourging by the Roman whip, which was something that, some people would die beneath that. And it was only then that Paul mentioned, oh, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen, which is when Lysias then changed his strategy a bit. Now, Lysias paints a little bit of a different picture. They were accusing this man, and I learned he was a Roman citizen, so I swept in and I rescued this person, and I've protected him ever since. And so anyway, Lysias, and maybe some have speculated that Lysias was still worried about whether Paul might lodge charges against him for the abuse that he had sustained at the hands of Lysias. And Lysias might already be developing his own kind of initial defense to any charges by restating the facts vastly more favorably to the role that Lysias played here than was actually what occurred. But anyway, there you are. That's the Lysias version. Since I wanted to know the charge for which they accused him, I had him brought to the council. I found he was accused concerning questions of their law, which was an unfathomable mystery to most of these Romans, but was charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering the accusers to state before you what they have against him. And this sets up then the second trial. The first trial was before the council. The second trial will be before Felix and Festus, and principally Felix, and that's where they will send this delegation from Jerusalem. Their hired gun lawyer coming along who will name Tertullus, and he will make an eloquent speech accusing Paul of all kinds of evil things, and so we'll have more what appears to be an actual trial at that point. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him during the night to Antipatris. Antipatris is a town that was about 30 miles from Jerusalem. It had been founded by Herod the Great, and it was named in honor of Herod's father, whose name was Antipater. And so Antipatris was simply the city that was named in honor of that person. The next day, they let the horsemen go on with him while they returned to the barracks. So there were 70 horsemen. The 70 continue with Paul going to Caesarea, but obviously once they're out of Jerusalem, they know the immediate threat is past, and it doesn't require 470 people to accompany him all the way to Caesarea. When they came to Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor, to Felix, and they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he belonged to. This is a jurisdictional question. Felix did have jurisdiction over Syria, Cilicia, and Judah, and so he wanted to make sure that Paul was actually a citizen within the jurisdiction that Felix could dispose of. So it's an initial question of standing, really, in some ways, as far as his status there before Felix, or whether or not Felix would have to refer him to some other individual who would deal with him under Roman law. Paul said he was from Cilicia. That did indeed trigger jurisdiction on the part of Felix. And he said, okay, I'll give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. So the accusers would come from Jerusalem, and there would be this hearing that would take place on that occasion. Then he ordered him to be kept under guard in Herod's headquarters called the Praetorium, and Paul is there for a few days. It's not too many days until we have his actual trial. Father, we're grateful for the opportunity to continue with these inquiries into this wonderful story of your great apostle. We pray that we would all be encouraged as we see the way that you bore him, knowing that the same God that bore him carries us as well in whatever you call us to accomplish in your name. We give you thanks for it now. We ask your blessing on us and bless the second service as we gather once again to worship. We give you thanks in the name of Christ.